All right, this is part 2 of my video examining Ian Juby's video, Chopping Down the Tree of Life. I want to make a couple of points before I get started. The first one is that Ian Juby approved that first part as a video response to his video. And I want to say, Ian, I'm actually surprised and amazed. And that was pretty amazing. I'm glad that you did that. I think that's really cool of you. And I think it's certainly a plus side on the Ian Juby character discussion. I think that you approved that. Again, I do appreciate it. I'm not going to get. I know there's a discussion on the pros and cons of Ian Juby's base character or something on that video, and I'm not going to really take a side on it. I understand both sides. Ian Juby seems like the kind of guy that I'd love to go have a beer with. But at the same time, his more vocal dissenters could be and possibly are. And, I'm not the best person to judge somebody's online persona, as I learned the hard way that how they portray themselves on YouTube and then when you meet them in real life are 100% polar opposites. But that's again an aside. From what I've seen, Ian Juby, he might be being deceptive. He might be playing a character. He might be just innocently making mistakes. And again, I'm not going to weigh in on which side I tend to support in this. But that's all on a side. Sorry. See, I'm rambling on. This is going to be one of those videos because the first section that he tackles. The first thing that I'm going to tackle from his video in this video is a pretty complex issue, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on it. So I'm going to get started. So hope you guys enjoy this.
We've all heard the dramatic story about how our ancient fish ancestor grew legs and walked up onto land, becoming the first land animal. In an attempt to trace these evolutionary changes, Italian scientists monkeyed with the DNA of a zebrafish, inserting Hox genes from a mouse into the fish.
In reading the Freitas et al. Paper, I don't see anywhere where they claim to have inserted the Hox genes from a mouse into a fish. Maybe I missed it, but all I see, the only thing from a mouse that I see that they inserted, and I'll explain the meaning of it later on, is the CSC enhancer sequence. Oh yeah, and if you look at the top of the paper, right underneath the author's names, that has author's affiliations, and they're listed as Spanish scientists working at a Spanish university, not Italian.
So Freitas et al. Took the Hox D13 gene from a mouse and inserted it into a zebrafish embryo.
Come on, Ian, you're making this tough on me here. I trust that you've read the paper. Otherwise you wouldn't be commenting on it, right? It pretty clearly states in that paper that they did not insert any mouse Hox D13 genes into this fish. I'm not sure where that comes from even. It's not in the paper. It's not even in the pop science versions of that paper. The first time you said that, I thought maybe you misspoke and you really meant the cis-C element enhancer or regulatory sequence, but now you said it again and specifically named the gene they are supposed to have inserted. Well, anyway, I'll let you go on.
Lo and behold, the zebrafish grew badly mutated fins. Freitas et al. Felt that these fins vaguely resembled a leg more than a fin, and concluded that the common ancestor of the mouse and the zebrafish must have had the Hox D13 gene because the zebrafish was influenced by the Hox gene.
All right, I apologize here, but at best, it sounds like you're talking about a paper that you've never actually read. And at worst, it sounds like you're deliberately misrepresenting what the authors intended to do, what the point of the experiment or what the results they found were. And I'm going to have to go into some pretty painful and tedious detail here. Again, this is going to be long. First, I want to talk about the how this works. Now, in the same issue of Developmental Cell, where the Freitas et al. Paper is a great paper by Schneider and Shubin. Shubin, the discoverer, one of the discoverers of Tiktaalik. But they have a sort of an introductory, a very easy to read introduction to this article explaining why it's important. And I'd recommend you read that. I really would recommend, Ian, that you take a look at that, because I think you might gain something if to understand what this is about. But I'm going to get into some painful detail about tetrapod evolution and fish evolution, and kind of explain it. Now, there's another article by Shubin et al. Again in 2009 in Nature. I'm sorry. I'll put a link down below to it for those of you that have access to journal articles in Nature. But I'll try to summarize a little bit here. Guys know my summaries aren't necessarily short. But first of all, okay, what happens during limb genesis in vertebrates, okay, is there's this HOXD13 gene, right, that produces a limb bud. It does this in fish, does this in tetrapods. And it grows what's called the stylopod, which in tetrapods is the upper arm or upper leg, the humerus and femur. And then another set of these HOX genes activates, that grows what's called the zygopod. That grows the forearm, the paired bones in the tibia, fibula, radius, and ulna in tetrapods, and lengthens the limb bud in fishes. And then there's a really interesting thing that happens after that. It's the second phase of the HOX13D. In other words, the gene that grew the stylopod reactivates. And this is where it becomes really important, because in tetrapods, this reactivation, actually in fish as well, reactivation grows what's called the apical ectodermal ridge. Now, again, this happens in both fish and in tetrapods, but the effect from that point on is dramatically different and critically different. In tetrapods, this apical ectodermal ridge grows into what's called the autopod. That's the wrist and hand bones of a tetrapod, right? In fish, it starts the development of what's called the dermal bone, the fin rays, right? Fish they have a sort of a limb bud, and then there's these long rays connected by a web, if you've ever seen a fish's fin, right? And it might seem sort of intuitive at some point that the fingers of a tetrapod are sort of homologous to the rays of a fish's fin, but it turns out that's not even close to being the case. They're very, very different, because the fin rays of a fish that grow from this apical ectodermal bud, the AER, are actually dermal bone. It's not part of the endochondral skeleton. While in tetrapods, it's part of the same skeletal system that the stylopod, the zygopod, and then this autopod grows, separate from the fin rays. If you've ever seen the lobe-finned fishes, they have all of the same arm bones, hand bones of a tetrapod, more or less. But then at the end of it, they still have these fin rays, and they're very separate structures, and their development has been something of a mystery. And in the Shubin 2009 paper, he talks a bit about this. But what's been found is that it's really difficult to turn a fish fin into a tetrapod limb, because if you modify this HOXD13, the same part that grows the hand bones of a tetrapod or the fin rays of a fish, you end up without an autopod. Okay, in other words, if you think, well, the ancestors of tetrapods just lost those genes that grow fin rays, right? Simple enough. But they're basically tied together in such a way that if you lose the fin rays, you lose the autopod as well, right? So it's kind of been kind of as Ned Flanders says, a noodle scratcher. How could you get there from here? How could you evolve a tetrapod limb from even a lobe-finned fish's fin without, because of the fact that the Hox D13, the second phase of it, is critical for growing both, right? And it was a legitimate mystery, and it's one that I'm surprised creationists didn't grab onto in 2009 and say, here's a mystery you guys can't answer, in which case we would have said, yeah, you got us. I'm sure there's a good answer, but we don't know it yet until 2012, and that's where the Freitas et al. Paper comes in. What they did is they found that when they took these zebrafish embryos, and during this second phase of the Hox 13D, which the zebrafish have, it was zebrafish Hox 13D. That was the gene they used. It was in the fish already. But if they duplicated that gene, or they used several different methodologies to make the gene overexpress itself so that it produced more of its products than it would normally produce, they found something interesting happened. The after what would be homologous to the zygopod, that stage of development, you get this elongation of the fin, and you still grew fin rays, but they're greatly reduced, right? So you're closer to the tetrapod limb arrangement. You haven't gotten there yet because you still have these darn fin rays to deal with that can't be taken out without ruining the whole thing. So they started looking. Now, in tetrapods and fish, this secondary growth phase is mediated by what are called these cis regulatory genes, this cis A, cis B, and cis C in tetrapods. Fish only have cis A and cis B. It's present in the fish. But what they found is, and this is really interesting, is that when they added this is where they added the mouse cis C, because fish don't produce it naturally. So they had transgenic fish with this that produced the cis C. Guess what happened? The fin rays didn't grow, and something the researchers believe to be, and I think that is that they grow what's equivalent to an autopod. The distal part of the limb grows into this sort of a paddle-like thing that seems to have what do you call it? It's endoskeletal or endochondral elements inside of it. So now, even though fish don't produce this cis C naturally, they don't produce it, so this would never happen in nature. They hypothesize that the great mystery of how do you get from a fish's fin to a tetrapod limb is a duplication or a mutation that enhances the activity during the second phase of this Hox D13, right? And then a mutation in the cis regulatory elements that would produce something equivalent to a cis C that would then cause the fin rays to not grow, but the autopod to develop. So what they did, now they never concluded that this is how it happened. That's not the conclusion. Wasn't the experiment. The experimenters were not trying to grow a leg on a fish. The experimenters were trying to determine how, with the fewest possible changes, can you get from one type of structure to another type of structure, solving the mystery of getting rid of the fin rays while still retaining the autopod. And they succeeded. They appear to have succeeded. Again, it could have happened a completely different way. There may have been a whole different pathway it actually happened. We don't know that. But making the assumption, we all work on assumptions, that it did happen, here's one way that it could have happened with the fewest possible steps, with fairly simple mutations to produce the tetrapod limb, or the ancestor of the tetrapod limb. And of course, once that tetrapod limb exists, then selection can, make it better at supporting the fish's weight. It can, other things, other mutations can lengthen it, strengthen it, make it more akin to the leg of a salamander or something, right? If that makes sense. So that was the question. That was the sort of why this Freitas et al. Paper was so profound, okay? It wasn't some failure where they thought they were, you kind of implied that they, thought they were going to grow a leg and they just grew these little wobbly things and called them legs because of their bias or something like that, as if the experiment was a failure unless you're completely deluded by, evolutionary indoctrination or something like that, when it wasn't. And this is something I see a lot of creationists do. They will take an experiment, a perfectly good experiment that achieved the goals. It answered the questions the experimenters were asking, and they'll call it a failure. An example being, if you design an experiment to see if you can produce amino acids abiotically under seemingly natural conditions, is this possible? And the experimenters say, look, voila, we did. We created some amino acids using abiotic mechanisms, right? Creationists will often report that as they were trying to make life in a test tube and they failed. They only produced a few amino acids. Do you see what I'm saying? And I don't know that that's what you were intending to do here by painting this a failure, like you kind of did, or if you didn't understand it, or what. But it's, again, I recommend you read the Schneider and Shubin introduction, and I think you'll get a lot more insight as to what this article was really about.
Now, reading the Nature paper, it's real easy to miss a key point in the paper.
First of all, the article's not in Nature. It's in a journal called Developmental Cell. That's a journal title at the top of the article. Right there, there's the journal name, typically. Under that, there's the title, then the authors, then the author's affiliations, and the front page. Anyway, so, or you can just look at the front cover if you have the whole magazine in front of you. But that aside, I'm going to take, you say there's one thing that's easy to miss. I'm going to, with all due respect, I think there's more than one thing in this article you found easy to miss.
Now, reading the Nature paper, it's real easy to miss a key point in the paper. But luckily for us, it's mentioned clear as day in the Spanish newspaper, El Mundo. Now, I don't read Spanish, but that's okay. I have a Spanish to English dictionary, and as near as I can figure, the article reads, they've only been able to take the development of the modified organisms until the 4th day of life, owing to, because of the fact that come to this point, the larvae, they need to feed themselves, and for this purpose, they need to swim, something that they cannot do with these members artificially modified. Translation of the translation? The mutated embryos died after 4 days because they can't swim and they can't feed themselves. Yeah! That's some evolution, ain't it?
Go to your happy place. Go to your happy place. Go to your happy place. Okay. Ian, you don't have to go to a Spanish newspaper to find out how long the embryos lived. I would highly recommend you pick up your copy of Freitas et al. In the journal Developmental Cell, and you look at figures 1, figures 2, and figure 3, where they have multiple pictures in each of those figures of the embryos at varying stage of development, from 48 hours after fertilization to 150 hours after fertilization. The majority of pictures in that article that they show, the majority were taken at developmental stage at 120 hours after fertilization. 120 hours is 5 days. 150 hours is a little over 6 days. So I don't know if your El Mundo article actually said only 4 days. If they did, they're wrong, or your translation's wrong. Something's wrong, but you should have looked in the original journal before making the claim. And again, to reiterate my point from before, the experimenters were not trying to demonstrate, upwards beneficial whatever evolution in this. The point was to show a plausible mechanism for using existing Hox gene architecture to produce a tetrapod type distal portion of a tetrapod limb from a fish fin. That was the point they were trying to do. That's what they were attempting, and that's what they succeeded in showing.
We've seen where similar or identical Hox genes were used in multiple organisms. In fact, some of those common Hox genes are found in organisms whose alleged common ancestor did not have the same Hox gene.
Identical Hox genes in organisms whose common ancestor didn't have those Hox genes. I'm sorry, Ian, but that's kind of a whole bunch of load of factually incorrect statement based on your honest misunderstanding of the material at hand, with no attempt at deceit intended. All right, I think that's enough for today. There's quite a bit more of this video to go through. I've kind of covered the parts I really wanted to cover, but I'll probably end up finishing it up. So I'll do a part 3. Thanks again for watching.